There are moments in history when a single miscalculation by a powerful actor sets off a chain reaction that nobody fully anticipated. And what Donald Trump has just done to Canada may be one of those moments. Because what started as a tariff campaign designed to produce Canadian compliance has instead produced something that Washington is only now beginning to comprehend in its full dimensions. Canada under Mark Carney did not just push back. Canada set the world on fire. It ignited a global response, economic, diplomatic, institutional, political, that has drawn allies into new alignments, activated international institutions in ways they had not moved in years, and sent a signal to every country watching that the rules of engagement with American economic pressure have fundamentally changed. It's honestly hard to believe that the fatal error at the center of this story was made by the administration that prided itself above all else on its understanding of leverage and power. But the evidence is now impossible to ignore. Trump's miscalculation was not just tactical, it was strategic, structural, and it may prove to be irreversible in its consequences. This is not a story about tariffs anymore. This is a story about how one country's defiance of the world's most powerful economy became the spark for a global realignment. That is rewriting the rules of international trade, reshaping alliance structures, and fundamentally altering the balance of economic power in ways that will define the decades ahead. Let me take you through everything. To understand what Trump's fatal error actually was, you need to understand what he thought he was doing and why that understanding was so fundamentally wrong. The tariff campaign against Canada was built on an analysis that was superficially compelling and structurally flawed in the ways that matter most. The superficially compelling part, Canada sends approximately 75% of its exports to the United States. That dependency is real, significant, and has shaped Canadian trade vulnerability for generations. A country that depended on access to your market, the logic ran, cannot afford to fight you for long. The structurally flawed part, that analysis treated Canadian vulnerability as a one-way street when the actual economic relationship ran in both directions through production systems so deeply integrated that disruption could not be contained within Canadian borders. But the deeper flaw, the one that makes this a fatal error rather than simply a strategic miscalculation, was not economic. It was psychological and political. Trump's team assumed that Canada, like most countries before it, would calculate the cost of resistance against the cost of accommodation and choose accommodation. They assumed that Carney, as a new prime minister navigating a difficult relationship with Washington, would prioritize the appearance of reasonable diplomacy over the substance of genuine resistance. They assumed that the international community, preoccupied with its own concerns, would observe the Canada confrontation with mild sympathy for Ottawa, but without taking action that materially altered the balance of the dispute. Every single one of these assumptions was wrong. And the wrongness of those assumptions, compounded across months of a confrontation that kept producing outcomes the administration had not modeled, is what transformed a trade dispute into the global conflagration Canada has now lit. Reports from throughout the past year documented the moment when the confrontation transformed from a bilateral trade dispute into a global event of genuine consequence. The transformation did not happen all at once. It accumulated through a series of developments, each of which expanded the circle of actors engaged with the confrontation and deepened the global implications of its outcome. The first development was Canada's retaliatory tariff announcement, precise, targeted, designed with an understanding of American political geography that left Washington visibly rattled. The second was the energy deal that redirected Canadian strategic resources toward European and Asian partners, introducing an energy cost uncertainty into the American economic picture that activated business communities and legislative constituencies the administration had not anticipated needing to manage. The third was the USMCA legal filings, formal dispute cases that embedded the confrontation in binding international legal processes and forced a conversation about the reliability of American treaty commitments that resonated in capitals well beyond Ottawa. The fourth was the global diplomatic offensive that positioned Canada at the center of a gathering coalition of countries committed to the rules-based trading order, a coalition that began attracting formal alignment from European partners, Indo-Pacific allies, and multilateral institutions with a speed and a substance that transformed the bilateral dispute into something resembling a global referendum on the principles governing international economic relations. By the time all four of these developments were simultaneously in motion, the confrontation had escaped the bilateral frame the administration had designed it to operate within. And the consequences of that escape were accelerating in ways Washington was struggling to track, let alone manage. Now, understanding the global fire that Canada lit requires examining the historical context carefully because there are important precedents for what happens when a determined middle power refuses to accept the terms a great power seeks to impose. Think about what happened when de Gaulle's France refused to accept American dominance of NATO's command structure in the 1960s. The immediate American reaction was frustration and diplomatic pressure. The longer-term consequence was a recalibration of alliance relationships that produced a NATO ultimately more durable and more genuinely multilateral than the American-dominated structure de Gaulle had rejected. Think about what happened when a coalition of developing countries in the 1970s pushed for a new international economic order, demanding reforms to the global trade and financial system that reflected their interests rather than those of the post-war architects. The immediate response from established powers was resistance and dismissal. The longer-term consequence was a permanent shift in the conversation about global economic governance that eventually produced institutional reforms that would not have occurred without the challenge. Think about what happened when the European Union in Trump's first term responded to American steel and aluminum tariffs with precisely targeted countermeasures and then engaged in extended legal battles at the WTO. The immediate confrontation was costly and disruptive. The longer-term consequence was a demonstration that the European Union had both the will and the capacity to defend its economic interests against American unilateral action. A demonstration that shaped subsequent negotiations. Canada's situation shares structural features with each of these precedents while being distinctive in ways that make its global fire potentially more consequential than any of them. Canada is simultaneously a major trading power, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, a NATO ally, a G7 member, and the most deeply integrated economic partner the United States has. When a country with that combination of attributes decides to set the world on fire rather than accommodate American demands, the global resonance is qualitatively different from anything a more peripheral actor could produce. So, what does it actually mean to say that Canada set the world on fire? In what specific concrete ways is that fire now burning? The fire is burning in 5 distinct and interconnected arenas, each of which deserves serious examination. The first arena is the alliance architecture. Canada's confrontation with the United States has accelerated a fundamental reconsideration among Western allies of the terms on which the American alliance relationship rests. European partners who had managed their own frustrations with American pressure through careful bilateral diplomacy found in Canada's principled resistance a coalition opportunity and a normative framework that encouraged more assertive defense of their own interests. The conversations that began in the margins of G7 meetings and NATO summits about the need for more distributed, less American-dependent alliance arrangements gained new urgency and new political traction from the Canada president. The fire in the alliance architecture is not about the destruction of Western alliances. It is about their fundamental reconfiguration toward genuinely multilateral arrangements rather than American-led structures where other members are expected to follow. The second arena is the global trading system. Canada's USMCA legal filings, its public defense of rules-based trade principles, and its active engagement with multilateral institutions in the context of the confrontation have collectively given new life and new political energy to the rules-based multilateral trading system at precisely the moment when that system was most under pressure from American unilateralism. Countries that had been waiting for someone to articulate and organize the defense of the multilateral framework found in Canada's approach a vocabulary, a strategy, and a coalition structure they could align with. The fire in the trading system is the fire of renewed institutional commitment from countries determined to preserve the framework even as the United States retreats from it. The third arena is the energy market. Canada's decision to accelerate its energy diversification, redirecting strategic resources toward European and Asian partners through deals that provide genuine market alternatives to American buyers, has introduced permanent uncertainty into the North American energy supply architecture. The fire in the energy market is the fire of a structural realignment that will reshape energy pricing, supply security, and commercial relationships across multiple continents for decades. The fourth arena is the global diplomatic order. Canada's emergence as the intellectual and diplomatic leader of the coalition defending the rules-based order has created a new center of global leadership gravity that did not previously exist in quite this form. Countries looking for a credible, principled, and strategically coherent champion of multilateralism have found one, and the alignment of those countries around Canada's framework has given Carney's government a diplomatic weight far exceeding what Canada's size would normally command. The fifth arena is the domestic political environment within the United States itself. The fire Canada lit has burned inward as well as outward, activating American business communities, agricultural organizations, energy industry groups, and manufacturing sectors whose communication with their legislators is creating internal political pressure on the administration that is proving more difficult to manage than the external diplomatic pressure from foreign governments. Here is where the consequences of Trump's fatal error become most visible in concrete, measurable terms. Because the fire Canada lit is not burning in abstraction. It is burning in data, in market movements, in institutional decisions, and in political dynamics that analysts are documenting in real time with a specificity that makes the scale of the miscalculation impossible to dismiss. Global supply chain restructuring decisions tracked by logistics and manufacturing industry consultancies show a pattern of companies with North American exposure accelerating their development of alternative sourcing arrangements at a pace that reflects strategic repositioning rather than temporary disruption management. The speed and the scale of this repositioning suggests that businesses are not waiting to see how the Canada-US confrontation resolves before adapting to a world in which North American supply chain reliability is no longer an assumption they can plan around. Financial market data from bond markets, currency markets, and equity valuations shows persistent pricing of North American trade uncertainty that is not moderated even in periods when the political rhetoric of the confrontation has temporarily softened. Markets are telling a story about durable structural change rather than temporary disruption. Diplomatic communication from multiple allied governments documents a sustained and serious recalibration of alliance and trade strategies that reflects the Canada president directly. Countries that had previously managed their relationships with American economic pressure through quiet accommodation are explicitly modeling alternative approaches informed by Canada's demonstrated capacity to resist and survive, and in some dimensions to thrive through direct confrontation with American tariff campaigns. The IMF's successive downward revisions to its North American and global growth forecasts, each citing the trade confrontation as a primary contributing factor, are accumulating into an economic record of damage that is being written in real numbers affecting real people in real time. Let's talk about what the expert community is saying, because independent analytical assessments of what Canada has set in motion add important dimensions that give the story its full scope. Foreign policy scholars at major institutions have each published assessments arguing that Canada's response to the American tariff campaign represents a historically significant demonstration of middle power strategic capacity, one that will be studied and emulated by governments navigating similar challenges for decades. Trade economists have noted that the combination of instruments Canada deployed, retaliatory tariffs, diversification, legal challenges, energy repositioning, and global diplomatic coalition building, represents a more sophisticated and more comprehensive response to great power economic coercion than any previous middle power confrontation with American trade pressure has produced. Security analysts have observed that the reconfiguration of alliance relationships accelerated by the Canada confrontation is producing a more distributed and potentially more resilient Western security architecture, one that is less dependent on American consistency and more capable of functioning through periods of American political turbulence. Economists specifically focused on the long-term structural implications of the confrontation have made a point that deserves particular attention. The diversification of Canada's trade relationships and the acceleration of alternative energy market development set in motion by the confrontation will produce permanent changes in the global distribution of economic relationships that will persist regardless of how the immediate political dispute is ultimately resolved. The fire Canada lit, in other words, will keep burning long after the immediate confrontation has moved on. The political fallout from Trump's fatal error, both its domestic American dimensions and its global ones, tells the story of a miscalculation whose consequences have exceeded what the administration was prepared to manage. In Canada, the confrontation has produced the most sustained period of national political cohesion in recent memory. Carney's approval numbers have remained elevated through the period of maximum economic disruption. Provincial governments across the political spectrum have aligned with the federal government's approach. Business communities, labor organizations, and civil society groups that rarely find common cause have united around the shared experience of defending Canadian sovereignty under economic pressure. The domestic political foundation Carney has built through this confrontation is more durable than anything a successful negotiated accommodation would have produced, because it is built on demonstrated strategic courage rather than managed retreat. In the United States, the political consequences of the fatal error are still unfolding but are increasingly visible in the internal dynamics of the Republican coalition. Business communities that are core Republican constituencies are in sustained communication with their legislators about the economic costs of the confrontation. Farm state senators are navigating between party discipline and constituent pressure in ways that create visible internal friction. Energy industry groups are processing the implications of Canadian market diversification with a sobriety that contrasts sharply with the administration's public dismissiveness about Canada's strategic options. And American consumers, encountering tariff-related cost increases in their daily economic lives, are generating diffuse but durable political sentiment that the administration's communications operation is struggling to redirect. Internationally, the political consequences are perhaps the most consequential in their long-term implications. American diplomatic capacity across the full range of international issue areas, security, climate, technology, governance, development, finance, is being constrained by the damage the tariff confrontation has done to American credibility as a reliable partner and a principled actor in the international system. Let's be clear-eyed about the long-term significance of what Canada has set in motion because historical perspective is essential for understanding why this moment matters beyond the immediate politics and economics of the confrontation. Great powers make fatal errors with some regularity. The errors become fatal not simply because they fail to achieve their intended objectives, but because they reveal something about the Great P's understanding of the world that undermines confidence in its future judgment and its future reliability. Trump's tariff campaign against Canada revealed three things about American strategic thinking that the rest of the world will not soon forget. It revealed that the administration did not fully understand the integrated nature of the economic relationships it was seeking to exploit as leverage. It revealed that the administration had significantly overestimated the asymmetry of the Canada-US relationship and significantly underestimated Canada's capacity and willingness to resist. And it revealed that the administration was willing to treat the rules-based institutions it had itself created and championed, USMCA, the WTO framework, the alliance commitments embedded in NATO as optional rather than binding when they conflicted with short-term political preferences. These revelations do not simply affect how the world thinks about the Canada confrontation. They affect how the world thinks about American reliability, American judgment, and American commitment to the institutional frameworks that international cooperation depends on. And in international affairs, as in financial markets, confidence once lost is recovered only slowly and at considerable cost. What Canada has set on fire is ultimately something more significant than any individual trade agreement, any specific tariff rate, or any bilateral diplomatic relationship. It has set on fire the assumption embedded in American strategy and in the calculations of American allies that the United States can apply economic pressure to deeply integrated partners without generating costs that flow back through the same integration that created the pressure in the first place. It has set on fire the assumption that smaller partners confronting great power economic coercion have no effective tools beyond accommodation. And it has set on fire the assumption that the rules-based international order is too dependent on American leadership to survive and defend itself through periods of American unilateralism. These assumptions were always more contestable than the conventional wisdom acknowledged. Canada's response to Trump's fatal error has made their contestability visible, demonstrable, and actionable in ways that will permanently alter how countries large and small, allied and non-aligned, think about their own strategic options in a world where American commitment to the frameworks it built can no longer be taken for granted. The fire is burning, the world is watching, and the chapters ahead will determine whether what Canada has set in motion produces an international order that is more distributed, more genuinely multilateral, and more resilient than the American-dominated framework it is replacing, or simply a more dangerous world of competing bilateral power relationships in which the absence of shared rules imposes costs on everyone, including the powerful. That question does not have a settled answer, but Canada has ensured it will be answered through contest and negotiation rather than through simple acceptance of American terms. That is what it means to set the world on fire. And that fire, whatever its ultimate consequences, was lit by a fatal error that the Trump administration will not easily undo.